Hello everyone, this is MMAsherdog for BluffTheSpot.com for the Lab Plus. Nice to see you guys back. Today I'm going to cover bluff catching, and bluff catching obviously happens very frequently, and it's very difficult to do. It depends a lot on your opponents, and obviously on your hand and range, etc. So there's a lot of factors at play. That's why I wanted to talk about it today. So let's keep the intro short and just get into the hands. One of the Bluff the Spot students was kind enough to send me some hands. Most of them were at 1-2 no limit, and I believe one of them at 50 cents a dollar. So we're going to review them the best we can, and we're going to take into account both practical and theoretical knowledge. So let's get started. We have pocket eights in the big blind. This hand is virtually always just defended. Occasionally could 3-bet if you like. And we get a bittersweet flop in Queen Jack 8. And when you see flops like these, some people would bet range small, some people bet large, some people mix it up. So I would immediately take a very good look at my opponent's bet size and, think, how often is he betting? How polarized is he betting? How does his bet size affect his hand in the future? So our opponent bets a little bit under half pot, which is kind of a funny sizing. On this board, you would check raise sometimes, but not that frequently. Obviously, your opponent is going to be quite far ahead when it comes to sets, when it comes to, for instance, big flushes, etc. So we can check raise occasionally, but not very often. So pocket eights, as a standard, will be a check call. And if the board runout doesn't change too much, generally you would want to end up calling a hand like this, because on some runouts you could beat weaker value bets, and if you're folding a flop set, then you're not really calling much. Then you'd only end up calling, let's say, some flushes, and we will be check raising some of them. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We call. The king definitely changes things because villain now could have 2 pair or kings plus club. He could have improved to ace 10, which is now a straight. So our opponent is likely going to bet fairly large, but not over pot. I like his sizing. I think that's a good sizing. And with more hands beating us now, I don't think we should be check raising. We call, and the river's a 5, and suppose our opponent bets something like $40 here. This would just be a clear call. I mean, as I said, we are already check raising some flushes on the flop, so it's obviously important to not check raise all flushes on the flop, so your opponent cannot just go crazy here. But if we're folding a hand like this, we're just folding way too many hands in our range. Now, does our hand have great blockers? No, because our opponent is likely value betting 2 pair plus, at least a good 2 pair plus. So we block the weaker 2 pairs and hands like Queen 8, Jack 8, which is not that relevant. And also we don't block any flushes, we don't block any straights. So in the end, against a normal bet size, I would still call, but I'm not loving it. Our opponent uses a little bit of a funny bet size here. He goes for a small overbet. When he uses this sizing, I don't believe he's value betting 2 pair anymore. So the idea of calling just because you beat both bluffs as well as some value bets goes out the window. So now we have to look at, okay, what does this mean? Our opponent bets a little bit bigger on the flop, which is unorthodox, but okay. He bets big on the turn, which helps him. And now on the river, he bets kind of large. So when he bets 5 into 11 on the flop, you have to imagine he's not betting his full range. So a hand like pocket 10s or pocket 9s with a club would be a really nice bluffing hand here. However, when he doesn't bet his full range on the flop, you'd imagine him just checking that hand most of the time, right? And also, what's up with this small overbet? I don't really like this play, to be honest. I think he should go much bigger. If he says, hey, I have a big flush and you would have fast played most of them on earlier streets, I'm ahead of you, then he should just overbet far larger than just this small overbet. So then we look at, okay, some ace of clubs hands that he could be bluffing with. Well, ace 10 with a club makes a straight. Ace 9 is a hand that most people will not open raise. It's actually a hand you can open raise sometimes. But ace 9 is not a standard raise for most people. And then if villain had a hand like ace queen with the ace of clubs, well, he would usually bet the flop, but he wouldn't bet the turn. And the same goes for a hand like ace jack with a club, right? He would probably just check back the flop, or maybe bet the flop but check the turn. So what kind of hands is he bluffing with then? So we could maybe see an underpair, a hand like pocket 4s plus club. That's definitely possible, but that's a play that, remember, we're playing 1-2 no limit here. That's a play that at 1-2 you probably don't see very often. So the bluffs that villain's supposed to have, hands like, for instance, ace of clubs 9, pocket 10s, pocket 9s plus clubs, under pairs, maybe 9-8. Those are hands that you don't see in villain's range often enough. So I would say if you believe your opponent is competent, we absolutely have to call here. If you believe your opponent is not competent and he's kind of face up, just milking you for a little bit more extra money, then you can actually just fold. So you see it's actually very, very close here. Our hand strength is pretty good. Our blockers are non-existent. So in the end, we end up with a hand where you probably would have to call, but it's very close. Let's see what our villain does. Obviously, I hope he calls so we see a showdown. And he does fold, which actually shows quite a bit of discipline because our hero knows that this is not a standard fold. So he probably took into account that a lot of his opponents are under bluffing a little bit. And in case you guys are play like 2-4, 1-2, 50 cent a dollar, a lot of you guys probably do play around those stakes. I would probably recommend that you are a little bit careful when it comes to calling down in these unorthodox spots, because most players at low stakes, low mid stakes, they lack a bit of creativity and they don't show up with the funny hands they're supposed to show up with here. So when villains start betting a lot of money in spots where it's not easy to be bluffing, I would say they're generally under bluffing. So being a little bit careful with your range when defending seems prudent to me. So overall, nice hand. Let's go to the second one. So on to hand number 2. We've got aces in the middle position, and we raise, obviously. We see villain number 10 call here. He does have a full stack. If he did not have a full stack, combined with his unorthodox flat call in the cutoff, I would say this is likely a recreational player, but now we just don't know. In general, I do recommend 3-bet or folding the cutoff versus middle position, or at least cold calling a very tight range. And that's mostly because the rake's quite high. And obviously when you call, you're going to see more flops and pay more rake, combined with the fact that 3-betting only is already an excellent strategy. Villain number 7 calls. And when you raise quite small, this 2.2x raise, you can expect far more flat calls than when you raise, let's say, 2.5 or 3x. So we see a 5-3-3 flop, and a few years ago, the metagame would have been to just check range out of position on most boards, and on a lot of boards that makes sense. On this board, you absolutely cannot check range, because pocket 3s are probably not in cutoff's range. Pocket 5s could be. Of course, pocket 3s could be in this range, but it's unlikely, right? Because it's such a low pair, and villain is in the cutoff and not in the button, where he could flat a slightly wider range. So, and also because there's 2 3s out there, there's only one combination left. So full houses are not very common on this board. This is a board where you are far ahead because you have the most over pairs. You also don't have as many crappy hands. So we definitely should be betting here with some of our range. Now with aces specifically, checking would be a cool play because you have an overpair, but you don't really need protection, right? So I'd like to see you check here. And we do check, which I like. So when villain 10 checks behind, we can expect him to not have very much. Most villains tend to bet their hands like, 7s through 9s. Definitely possible he has them still, but a bit less likely. Now, villain 7, obviously, we have to worry about a little bit more because he could have pocket 5s, he could have pocket 3s, deuces, 4s, up to, let's say, 9s. I expect 10s to plus always get squeezed, 9s perhaps, 8s perhaps. This deuce hurts us a little bit because villain 7 could have pocket deuces, villain 10 probably not so often. And villain 7 bets over pot here, which again I think is not the greatest play. He may want to value bet hands like 5-6, 5-4, 6s, 7s, 8s. And with this sizing, you're kind of allowing the other players to just fold a lot. So this could just be the nuts and he's trying to milk you. That's definitely possible. Or he could obviously just have a hand like Jack 10 and feel like both of you are weak and he wants to get you off your hand. Either way, I'm not a gigantic fan of this bet sizing here because he's trying to mostly represent pretty good hands and not just the nuts or nothing. With aces, definitely go ahead and call. We block ace 4. We can use a spade on the river for bluff catching or bluff raising, let's say, and we just beat all of villain's bluffs. If he has Jack 10, let's say, he's dead. Villain 10 folds, which makes a lot of sense. And we just see the 6 of spades river, and this is again one of those spots where a lot of people tend to underbluff. If villain just picked a big sizing with hand like 7s or 8s, I don't see him bluffing with that hand. Pocket 4s, as a mergey turn bet is now a straight. His flush draws get there. So the hands that he would be bluffing with are just hands like Jack 10 that he's took a stab with. And then we see a slightly over third pot bet, which is kind of funny. So I'm not sure what this means, to be honest. If villain has a flush, his hand is worth a lot more money. If he's got a straight, his hand is worth a lot more money. If he's got a full house, his hand is worth a lot more money. So with this sizing, he's kind of saying like, hey, I got a hand like pocket nines, but pocket nines is not a value bet anyway. So his sizing doesn't make that much sense. His bet size doesn't really represent what he's trying to value bet, right? So because it's not as if we're calling with a hand like ace king on the river. So this is kind of a funny sizing. We need to win 21% of the time. We do block the nut flush. The issue is that villain has to, pick some random hands like that Jack 10 I mentioned before. And what you usually see in these spots is that when villain, let's say, bets 50 here, he'll include his bluffs like Jack 10. But then when he bets small, he's virtually never bluffing. So if you have a crazy read that this guy's just not bluffing for the small size, only for the large sizing, you could end up folding this hand, actually. The only issue is that this villain may be a little bit weaker, and he could just have a hand like pocket nines. So in the end, I think calling makes sense against a tricky villain. But like in the first hand, if your opponent is a little bit face up, you could make the tight fold. And you guys may be thinking like, hey, this is not a second time where the coach has said, hey, sometimes you call, sometimes you fold. Well, I knew that. What am I going to learn here? And the point is that a lot of these decisions are very, very close. So what I want you to do is look at the details of the hand. I want you to look at the fact that he cold called the small blind, not the big blind. I want you to notice the fact that he overbet the turn, not just bet, let's say, half pot or 3/4 or even third pot, right? I want you to look at all the sizes and the timing and all these little things that may give away a little bit of information. Because in reality, most hands are very close, right? I mean, if we had, let's say, pocket fives, okay, easy raise. If we have, let's say, king queen of spades, obviously we don't fold. The hands we're being presented with, our hands were calling and folding or even bluff raising, are very close in EV. So pay close attention to the small things that make you change your strategy potentially from, let's say, calling to folding. We do call, which I can't fault you for. Having the ace of spades definitely helps you. And villain does have pocket deuces. Okay, so he flatted the small blind, which is a fine play. And on the turn, I think he's kind of just a bit face up. I think his thoughts are as simple as, well, I got a full house, I'm going to overbet. Which obviously, I mean, you want to generally bet big when you have full houses, but what villain 7 is not thinking about is the rest of his range, right? Because he can have fours, he can have a 5, he can have 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s. And those hands don't want to bet so large. So a better strategy would have been to size down a little bit and include those hands in your value range. And then on the river, if you feel like let's say the river is a queen and you just lost a little bit of value, go for a large bet size. A very large bet size, if you like. So I don't like villains play too much. But I do think that our aces are a very close call. So nice hand again. Next hand, number 3. Ace queen is an easy raise under the gun, of course. This hand was played at NL 100, which means that your opposition is going to be slightly weaker than at NL 200. There's obviously not a big difference. At NL 200, everybody's just a little bit better, right? There's no gigantic difference. So that means that if you see, let's say, funny bet sizes, funny lines, or just plays that don't seem to make sense, it's more often than not a line that just isn't very good, right? Because obviously the average NL 100 player is slightly weaker than the average 200 NL player. So I'm going to look for inconsistencies here. Okay, we see ace king 10, which is a board which is fantastic for us, obviously. I'm not sure whether or not we have queen jack offsuit in our range. We should occasionally, but we definitely have queen jack suited. We definitely have aces, kings, 10s, king 10, ace 10, etc. So we can bet this board pretty aggressively. I'd like to see a larger sizing on this flop. So I'm not a fan of this size, to be honest. I think we should size up and mix up our strategy. When we raise under the gun, we're just going to absolutely smash this board. But villain is also going to hit this board quite hard. Some villains don't 3-bet ace king always. A lot of villains will not 3-bet 10s, as they should, right? They will have hands like king 10 and ace queen and even queen jack. So it's basically a strong range against a strong range. So just betting third prop range I don't think works out. Anyway, I do think that ace queen, especially having the club in your hand, is generally a good bet. And villain calls. So once he calls, I think we have the best hand very, very often. Villain could be slow playing ace king, king 10, 10s, queen jack, let's say, but he would mostly raise them. Other than maybe king 10. King 10 is not much of a raise. Turn to 6. And on this turn, I would definitely like to see an overbet if we decide to bet. This is, I don't like the sizing, to be honest. We're losing a lot of value here. On the flop, we're already saying, hey, we've got a very strong range. And now on the turn, there's just not enough money in the pot. If you're representing very strong hands, you should make the pot as large as you can. So you're missing out on a lot of money here. So don't be too distracted by the fact that there's a straight on board, because obviously villain would have check raised most of them. Can he have the nuts? Absolutely, he can, but that doesn't mean you should be too scared. So I'd like to see, if we bet this hand, I'd like to see an overbet on the turn. Not a gigantic one, not a bet of, let's say, 20, but definitely an overbet. So villain does call. And the river's a 9, and this is kind of funny because this hand is a 2-street value hand. This would be a hand to bet kind of big on the flop, kind of big on the turn, and check the river with. Or bet kind of big on the flop, check turn, and then call any reasonable sizing, or bet a reasonable sizing. 3 streets is kind of thin because villain could still have those slow played nuts sometimes. Although I think especially on the turn, if he calls queen jack on the flop, he will usually check raise. So I do think we have the best hand quite often. The issue is that villain will still call hands like ace king on the river, ace 10, king 10, and that type of stuff. 10s maybe even. So I think this hand is probably just a check back. And now we go for this a little bit under 3/4 pot sizing. You can use many sizes here. I would say a sizing around 3/4 pot makes sense. Also using an overbet sizing because you definitely want to leverage the fact that you have a lot more nutted combinations than your opponent does. And now villain check raises quite small. This is kind of a funky play. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. If villain had a hand like king 10, he should never check raise for value here. If he had ace 10, the same thing. So he's saying he's got a hand like a thin value raise, like for instance pocket 10s or ace king, but I don't think most players do that, right? Because we open under the gun and bet 3 times. So yes, ace king is an easy call, of course. However, once you check raise and we call, your hand is not good that often anymore. Plus the fact that you could easily just get shoved on, right? Because we do have at least 4 combos of queen jack suited and perhaps some offsuit combinations. So I think that if villain check raises here, he should be trying to represent queen jack. Maybe he wants to represent 8-7 of clubs, but that's about it. So I don't think this sizing makes sense. I think he should go with a far larger sizing to represent the nuts. So what about our hand then? Our hand is, in theory, pretty good for calling. We block ace-king, so we block one of the thin value bets he could still have, and we block queen-jack. And so here you have to think, okay, villain could easily overbluff, because villain is going to, let's say, defend queen-jack in the big blind for 12 combinations. Let's say he 3-bets half of the queen-jack suited, right? Maybe that's not entirely correct, but let's say half of them. So he's going to have 14 combinations of queen-jack on the flop. Now, against our third pot bet, let's say out of 14, he probably check raises like 10 of them. So he's got like 4 combinations left. And then, if we quickly go back to the turn, out of those 4 combinations, now, let's say he check raises like 2 more of them, right? Because he wants to sometimes play check, call, check, raise strategy. Sometimes he wants to delay until the river. So let's say he calls 2 of them. Of course, I could be slightly off or just making estimations, but I think that's pretty accurate. So by this river, he's got maybe like 2 combinations of queen jack, and maybe he's got an occasional hand like ace king or 10s, but he's going to end up with maybe like 4 value combinations, which is not very many. So 4 value combinations, we're getting 3-1, which means he gets to have 1 bluff, exactly 1. And if you start check raise bluffing in villain shoes with hands like ace queen, ace jack, king queen, king jack, jack 10, queen 10, maybe like pocket jacks or something like that, maybe something like queen 6 of clubs or jack 6 of clubs or some kind of combo draw, you can easily have 10, 20, 30 bluffs and 4 value combinations. So villain's play, as I said, doesn't really make a lot of sense. He can absolutely have the nuts. So don't say, hey, I got check raised today and I want my money back because villain showed me the nuts. He can have the nuts, but it's just pretty unlikely because of the way we played our hand, right? So that's a good lesson to show you, think about the whole hand. Now, had we gone back, let's say on the flop, let's say we bet $10 in the 5. A ridiculous bet size, but let's say we do. Now, out of, let's say, 14 queen jack combinations, maybe villain doesn't check raise any of them because he feels like he's so far behind on this board that he doesn't want to check raise much. So now maybe he check raises like 12 he check calls like 12 combinations, or maybe not. He check raises none of them. Who knows? So against his third pot bet, we can expect villain to check raise a lot. And then against his sizing, same thing, which really caps his range on later streets and makes you want to attack. So when he now check raises, I think he's potentially far overdoing it with hands like, you know, a pair plus a straight blocker. And so I do believe we should call. And villain shows up with king queen. I don't necessarily hate his play. I like the defend pre-flop. I don't mind the call on the flop. I don't mind the call on the turn. I don't even hate the check raise. The issue is that the sizing is far too large. And also, when you use a larger sizing, you get to have more bluffs, right? So you're getting more value with your value hands, and you get to bluff a little bit more frequently. And you obviously have an abundance of bluffs. So the point of this hand, guys, not only the bet sizes could the bet sizes be improved slightly, but also look for spots where villain has offsuit combinations that he could be bluffing with, and look for spots where villain is not really representing anything, because here he's representing a few queen jack combos, maybe a pocket tens ace king combo, and that's about it. So he's not really getting to this river with enough value hands to check raise at this frequency. Anyway, nice hand by us, and let's go to the next one. On to hand number 4, and we've got jack 10 in small blind. I tried to pick all kinds of hands, so you see, for instance, defending against check raises, just defending against barrels, in position, out of position, because obviously bluff catching is a very broad topic. So we raised jack 10 in a small blind. At 200 NL, I definitely recommend only raising or folding. The rake is far too high to be limping. Also, a lot of villains just don't 3-bet much. They overfold a bit, and they're just a bit weak post-flop, so raising makes a lot more sense. Now, if you were playing, let's say, a no-rake game against a player like OTB Red Baron, then limping makes a lot more sense. So we see the 10-5 deuce flop. This is a board on which range c-betting is a little bit too loose, but range checking is definitely too tight. We're going to have to mix it up. Generally, when we have top pair with a decent kicker, you want to bet. But it's very important to also have a strong checking range. So when we get stabbed into, we don't just check fold, or let's say we check all ace high and then fold to a turn bet. So we go for a third pot bet, okay? And we see the 6, and on the 6 we should be doing a ton of checking. Is the 6 very scary? No, not that much. I mean, villain can have maybe 5-6 offsuit or suited, definitely 10-6 suited, 3-4 occasionally, pocket 6s. So he'll improve a bit on this card, but not that much. We are going to brick this card a ton because we don't open and then c-bet that many 6s. We're going to have a lot of hands like jack 9, 8-9, queen jack, etc. that just miss and want to check fold. So I'd actually like to see us check this hand. And we do, which strengthens our checking range. I like that. And so, a little bit of information now. Okay, villain called the flop, and now he bets small on the turn. So when he bets a bit less than a third of the pot, he's value betting potentially any pair. So we don't have to call just based on blockers to the nuts, because villain's not representing the nuts. He could be value betting a hand as thin as pocket 3s, let's say. I definitely like the check call. You should also have a pretty wide check raising range against his small bet. And we see the 7 river. The 7 doesn't improve villain too much. He could have floated the flop with a hand like 7-8, or let's say like jack 7, stab the turn and now improved. So he can easily still have hands like jack 9 to be bluffing with, missed clubs. He could now turn a hand like 3s or 4s into a bluff potentially. So versus a regular bet size, we could beat value hands, as in we could maybe beat a 7, or we can beat a weaker 10, and there's not that many hands that beat us. So 10-7 offsuit, for instance, that's a hand that you should be checking back on the turn a decent amount of the time if you have a strong check back range as well. 10-7 offsuit, I also don't expect to be defended by the big blind with 200 NL rake. I wouldn't recommend that. So I do think that against a bet size of 23, we should end up calling. Also, if villain had something like queen 10, king 10, ace 10, he would usually raise the flop, or at least a decent amount of the time, right? So I don't think we lose to that many better 10s. Definitely possible, though. And villain has ace 6. Okay, that's interesting. So villain call pre-flop. That's fine. You could 3-bet bluff sometimes if you like. On the flop with the backdoors and the ace high, I think calling is a good play. Raising is fine too. And on the turn, yeah, I don't mind it. Just sometimes betting a 6, betting your best one with the ace kicker, and then having a club in your hand also helps. And on the river, villain 9 is not giving us credit for having a strong check call range, because he could obviously be behind against something like a set, or aces, or a better 10, or any 10, or like 9. So I think I like the fact that he went for a third value bet. It shows a bit of heart. It shows that he's not autopiloting, but finding small edges. And that's definitely something that you see, it especially at Zoom, is people, they play too quickly. They don't look for these small little edges. So I do like his idea, but I think this value bet is a little bit on the thin side. Also, he does block hands like ace high that potentially would call. So I'm not a big fan of the value bet, but I like the idea. So nice hand to us. And I would say this is a pretty easy call. So guys, whenever you beat value bets as well as bluffs, calling is generally recommended, right? Whereas if villain, let's say, bets 3x pot on the river, okay, now the fact that you have a 10 in your hand doesn't matter that much, because villain is not representing, let's say, a weaker 10. He's only representing, straights and sets, etc. So nice hand to us. Not the most difficult hand in the world, but it's important to not only show the quads over quads hands, super deep stack, because those hands don't really happen all that often, right? These types of, small to medium-sized pots where you potentially want to bluff catch or bluff raise, whatever you want to do, those occur way more frequently. So if you improve those types of spots, that's why you see your win rate skyrocket. All right, hand number 5. We've got ace-9 offsuit in the cutoff. We're occasionally raising middle position, so we're definitely raising in the cutoff. Villain 5 calls, so could be a recreational player, perhaps not, who knows. And villain 17 calls. Queen 6-4 is a pretty good board for everybody. Villain 15 probably has 4s and 6s sometimes, and the big blind definitely does as well. The big blind is also going to have hands like Queen 6, Queen 4, 4-6, just hands like Queen Jack, King Queen, etc. So we can go absolutely crazy here. Ace-9 is not a hand you want to bet very often because, you have you have ace high, but you don't really have showdown value. You don't really have any backdoors to bluff with. So at least if you had a hand like ace-5 suited, you have a good backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw. You'll block a hand like 6-5, 4-5. So your hand is okay to bet with. But ace-9 doesn't really do anything. It doesn't really accomplish very much. You're just making villain fold hands like jack-9 suited that he was going to fold anyway. So it gets checked through. Villain 17 checks, and he could definitely still have a hand to be trapping with. He could have defended 7-5 suited and aims to check raise or aims to check raise a set. But at the same time, I assume our villain or our hero has check range in this spot on the flop. So now it's time to get a lot of value because we've checked 4s and 6s and 8s and queens and kings, etc. So we want to bet most of them. Ace-9 specifically is a hand you could bet sometimes. First you want to prioritize high equity bluffs like, let's say, 10-9, hearts, etc. But ace-9 here sometimes could be a decent hand to bluff with, as in you block 8-9, you block pocket 9s, you have the ace of hearts. And when the river is something like a jack, it will kind of look like a lot of your bluffs get there, so you'll have kind of like a sneaky bluffing hand. Against weaker players who give up a lot and just don't really fight for pots, betting here is quite an aggressive, but could be a good play. So I don't mind this bet size. Of course, if you always do this with hands like King 10, Ace 9, etc., that's way too much. But mixing it up makes sense. I think the sizing makes sense as well. You're saying you've got a pretty strong hand, but not just a nuts or nothing. Villain 17 calls. And we see this ace river. This ace is not going to hit you that well, but sometimes. You're going to have hands like aces, maybe ace 8, ace queen, so you'll hit it occasionally. And then as for villain 17, he's not going to hit the ace too much. He could have checked like ace 6, ace 8 on the flop. He could have an ace high flush draw if he didn't have the ace of hearts, but that's about it. So this ace is not too relevant. We bet on the bigger side. And villain now check raises. And this is a very funny spot, right? Because what is he even representing? He's representing a hand like ace-6, ace-8 that he check on the flop on the turn with. And some villains would even be too nitty to check raise that, although I do think it's a good check raise. And then he's saying, well, I just trapped you on the turn. I check called 7-5 suited, and now I'm going to check raise. Which is a cool play, but not a play you see all that often. Or he has a hand like 6s that he delayed check raised. So this play is a little bit funny, because he's not really representing many hands again. So as for our actual hand, well, we've got one pair, top pair, which is all right, but not great. And then, well, do we block the nuts? Do we block a6? Well, we block it with an ace, yes. We block ace8, of course. But we don't block 7-5. We don't have a 7 or a 5 in our hand. And that's very difficult, right? Like, how do we block 7-5? You know, if we had a hand like a7 suited of hearts, we'd probably just check the river. So it's difficult to block the straight here. All in all, I think this is a spot where villain probably under bluffs significantly. This is like the classic spot at like low stakes, lower mid stakes, where it's very, very difficult for a lot of villains to come up with enough bluffs because they know they're not representing a whole lot of hands. So you'll see the population significantly under check raise. So as I said in a few hands ago, generally when you see these kinds of crazy plays, most villains tend to weigh under bluff. Now at high stakes, I unfortunately don't have this luxury because a lot of players are very creative and unorthodox. So when I get check raised here, I don't just say, well, easy fold with my average hands, because they will check call hands like the nuts, or you know they will make thin value check raises with hands like ace6, ace8. So all in all, I think this is probably a fold. We have many, many better hands. Because remember, we checked whole range on the flop. So we've got 4s and 6s and 8s, and ace8 and ace6 and ace queen and queens and aces, and whatever other hand I missed. So I don't think we need to call with... This is basically the bottom of our value range, right? This is already a close hand on the river to be betting with. So if we bet and then call with with our worst value bet, and one that also doesn't block anything good, then we're basically calling our whole range. So we don't need to defend this hand in order to be defending at an appropriate frequency. Combine that with the fact that we think our opponents are maybe a little bit on the nittier side, this is definitely not a call. And as you can probably tell, towards the end of the hand, I was more confident in a fold than in the beginning of the hand. And that's because I take my time to do my analysis. So that's another little bit of advice I'd like to give you. Take your time. When you're in a big pot like this, he lets you play 4 tables of Zoom. Just sit out on the other tables, because this is a big decision, right? This could easily make or lose you a couple of big blinds in EV. So think it through, take your time. Think of every little part of the hand, right? From pre-flop all the way to the river, his sizing, his timing, his line, the reads you've got on him, any other metagame. Obviously, the fundamentals of the hand are very important, and then you make your decision. So I see a lot of students who think, you know, that playing more hands is better, and playing a lot of hands is good, but quality of play is always most important. So take your time in these spots. Take like 20 seconds, right? Because that's one of my weaknesses. I tend to call or fold pretty quickly here. And then 3 minutes later, when I'm in a different hand, I'm like, oh no, I remember something about this guy. Or I remember something that I've seen before, and because of that, I would have made a different play. But it doesn't matter if you remember 3 minutes later, because the money's still won or lost. So take your time before you make your decision. And villain has a6 of clubs. Okay, so credit to him. I think that's a pretty cool play. I like the defend in the big blind. I like the flop and turn check. And on the turn, he's thinking, well, I block 6s, I block aces, I block ace queen. I don't block any of the bluffs, which usually have like a jack or 10 or 9 or hearts in them. And on the river, it's a close check raise, but I don't mind it. So I think it's a pretty cool play, actually. Yeah, very nice play. Anyway, happens sometimes, we lose. Obviously, since we're bluff catching, right? When you bluff catch, you're not supposed to win the majority of the time. So I expect to see our hero lose the majority of these hands. That's normal. That obviously doesn't mean that he's a weaker player. Anyway, let's go to the next hand. All right, then we arrive at the last hand of the video. We've got ace-10 in the big blind. This hand is virtually always just called. Villain does actually min raise, so here already we've got a bit of information. Most people raise around 2.5 big blinds. Okay, our villain raised the minimum, which changes our range quite a bit. It makes our range a lot wider, which means that if, let's say, we flop pretty well on this board, our hand is going to be looking a lot better than if, let's say, we call a 3x raise. Because against his small sizing, we're defending hands like, for instance, Queen 8 offsuit, whereas against 2.5 or 3x, that's much closer. And at 200 rate, Queen 8 offsuit would be a fold. But against a min raise, it's not. So this hand, great example here, our hand is looking a lot better than it would against a bigger raise size. So villain bets 2/3 of the pot, okay. Despite the slightly larger bet size, I still expect him to bet quite often on this board. So we get the check raise pretty aggressively here. and ace-10. So we've got top pair, top kicker. This hand on a board this dry, I would say, is almost always best. So I'd like to see a check raise most of the time. We check raise, okay. Around 3.5x. And we get called. And the turn to jack, which is a decent card for both of us. We're going to check raise bluff some hands with a jack in it. For instance, hands like jack 8 suited or jack 9 suited with the back doors, or queen jack. So we hit this jack a decent amount of the time. Villain can obviously have hands like jack 10, pocket jacks. He could have just a bet called a hand like king jack or ace jack on the flop. So we both hit this card quite a bit. And I would like to see ourselves be careful on this card. So we end up checking, which I think is okay. Villain bets half pot. So, you know, if he were betting something like 17, 18, I would expect a super wide bet. But versus this half pot sizing, he's going to be a little bit tighter and a little bit more polarized. This hand is going to be great for calling down a lot of blanks because we block ace 10. Sorry, we block 10s, we block jack 10, we block aces, we block ace jack. And we don't block any of Villain's bluffs, right? Because Villain's bluffs are generally going to contain an 8, a 9, a queen, a king, a hearts, and we don't hold any of those cards. So you see, these, you know, generally when we unblock the bluffs but block value hands, those are the ones you generally want to end up calling with. Even though our hand strength on, let's say, a 3 river is only second pair. So, let's see what happens. I'd like to see a check call. So far, so good. And we see the 7 river, which is not the greatest card because 9-8 does get there. I would expect most villains to raise 9-8 suited always, obviously, but also a decent amount of 9-8 offsuits. C-bet the flop, call, and then stab the turn. So villain is going to have 9-8 here quite frequently. He's going to have it quite frequently here. As for 6-7, probably not so often. 7s, perhaps. 10-7, jack 7, perhaps, but again, slightly less frequently. So we do check, and I don't believe we need to have any leads on this river because the river does not improve us significantly, especially compared to him. It's not as if we're going to check call a 9 high straight draw on the turn very often. And villain bets half pot here, which is not a sizing I like too much. So when he uses this sizing, he's saying, I've got a pretty good hand, but not an amazing one. So he's saying, I've got ace 10, I've got a jack, I've got pocket queens, maybe pocket aces, something like that. Maybe he's got a hand like 10s or jacks, which is virtually the nuts, and he thinks, well, I kind of block my opponent's calling range, so let me size down a little bit. This hand, so in theory, this hand would never be a fold, right? Because as I said, your hand strength is decent, but you do a great job of unblocking villain's bluffs. The only reason to potentially find a fold here would be if you believe that villain's sizing is really poor. If you believe that if he had, let's say, 5-4 hearts, he would just always shovel in, or at least bet much larger. And so when he bets smaller, he's got exclusively medium strength hands. So if you have a read on him that he's not really balancing that right, then fighting a very tight fold would make sense, right? If you think, well, he's just always got queens, I don't care about theory, I just got to fold. Right, so if you play this hand at, let's say, NL50 or NL25, that would make more sense. However, we're playing at NL200 now, where villains are a little bit more tricky, and maybe they would use this sizing to say, well, I'm going to act like I have a medium strength hand, but actually got like a hopeless bluff, and maybe I will level my opponent into folding. So in the end, I would mostly like to see a call here. Again, villain could maybe even have the same hand for value, hand like king 10, ace 10, and we unblock the bluffs. Unless you just have the stone read that this is always a hand like queens, then we could end up folding. As a standard, I would not. We do end up folding, which I think is a small mistake, but I do like the fact that you're, aware of your surroundings. You're aware of what's happening. You're just not just letting yourself get milked. So, yeah. In the end, I think you played most of these hands quite well. Some of them I would have played a little bit differently, but overall you folded most of them, which I do like, especially at slightly lower stakes. And I think you're doing a good job of paying attention to all the tells that you may see. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. There is so much more to say about this topic. Obviously, I can't just talk forever, right? Our videos are generally 40 minutes long, but please feel free to give us some feedback or ask some questions, because this is a topic where if you want to fully cover it, we can spend 20 hours talking about it. So I hope you like this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Good luck at the tables, everybody.